Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. This is episode 131 of the Roundtable, where we're continuing our commentary on the players in the culture war. Today is the Neocons, once again joined by Keith Preston and Florian. Glad to have you guys here. So, to open up, there's what the neocons of all the elements were, on the one hand, more honest than the other groups we've been talking about, because the other groups talk about what they want to achieve and they never seem to get there. We've just give a brief summary. What the libertarians have ended up doing is just dismantling the New Deal economic system and replacing it with whatever we have now, despite their public goal was to, quote, dismantle the state, like that was going to happen. And then you had the liberals who ended up initially being coming out of the FDR era, being pro-labor, putting shackles on capital, to now just having these weird social fetishes and completely allowing the New Deal infrastructure to get stripped away. The conservatives conserve nothing except the military-industrial complex. But the neocons were, on the one hand, always honest. They always came out in favor of the military-industrial complex, and they always came out in favor of the forever wars. So it's like, okay, at least they told us up front what they wanted, right? Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't do their fair share of lying. So for the GWAT, beginning with Afghanistan and Iraq, they would say it was about regime change and democracy, which is garbage. It was never about that. It was about two things. First was money. We could think of like Dick Cheney and Halliburton. We don't need to relitigate that. But a lot of people made money from contracting, but then also the military procurements, and then also protecting the geopolitical interests of Israel. Because look at the target list. Iraq, right? Well, Saddam was a known enemy of Israel. Iran, right? Iraq and Iran were on the axis of evil speech that Bush gave. And then subsequently, Syria and Egypt with the Arab Spring. Libya too, right? All of these groups, there seems to be one beneficiary, and it's not the United States. But of course, the cloak. Now they'll just. Well, the thing is, they've always said Israel's our greatest ally. They've always said Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East. So again, there's still a little more honesty in the delivery, even though the democracy in Iraq and democracy in Syria was more of a smokescreen. And so what they want is a U.S. So there's the big picture is economics. Right after World War II, there's a global security commons which is protected by the United States, primarily the U.S. Navy, because that's where all the trade lanes are. But then, of course, little hotspots around the world, you got to deploy the Marines and other forces to, contain communism or fight terrorism, and that structure that was built up after World War II is basically the goal of the neocons. They want to keep that structure in place. One, they benefit financially from it. Many of them are in these NGOs or in the military-industrial complex or contractors or all three, depending on, what stage of their life they're in. This year, Dick Cheney's had a Halliburton again. So, it just keeps the slush fund keeps going, right? So there's that. Now, you couldn't just go out and say, hey, we want to invade Iraq because it's going to be profitable and it's going to secure the strategic interests of Israel. You can't say that. That's not going to whip up American support. So what you have to say is it's about democracy in Iraq, or it's about weapons of mass destruction. Now, and then the democracy angle was really hard with Libya and Syria under the Obama administration. They kept playing that game, though it wasn't really about that either, because, the Free Syrian Army became ISIS. That was great. It had nothing to do with democracy in Syria. And, we had slave markets in Libya after Gaddafi fell. Again, had nothing to do with that. That was the smokescreen to get people on board. And what they really are they are the political representation of the military class in this country. They represent the propaganda arm of the military-industrial complex. I think, symbolically and given our culture war framing that we've been working on, that's how I would describe the neocons. And they've been wildly successful, unfortunately so, right? All the other groups we've been talking about have failed in their goals. The liberals, the conservatives, the libertarians, the woke, they've all more or less failed in their stated goals, but the neocons haven't. And that's where we're in this situation now with Israel and Iran. It's kind of this weird standoff limbo right now, but the fact that we are here at this point in time is because the neocons have been so successful. And as you pointed out before, Keith, they're chameleons. They'll go from Democrats to Republicans, Democrats to Republicans. It doesn't really matter who's president. For example, Obama and Biden, it didn't matter. So as long as they're the ones making the strategic decisions, they're sort of the man behind the throne. Keith.
Yeah, well, I would agree with virtually all of that. And I'll do a little bit of a deeper dive as to what the neocons are and where they came from. I've written about this extensively. Like I have a couple of chapters in some of Paul Gottfried's anthologies on conservatism, where I talk about the origins of the neocons and what they really are. But a lot of things get labeled neocon that aren't really neocon. Like neocon is often used as a broad term that's describes, what people that are, say, super hawks, like, say, John Bolton, or ultra imperialist, or ultra Zionist, or actual Israeli nationalist, or the liberal hawks like the George Packer types, or aggressive liberal internationalists like Tony Blinken, or the so-called humanitarian hawks, the Samantha Power types. That's not really what the neocons are. The neocons are actually something smaller and more specific than that. But the neocons were a movement that came out of the far left in the 60s and 70s. And these were people that were mostly former radical leftists. They had been Trotskyites in some instances, or at least Trotskyite adjacent. Some of them had been associated with a guy named Max Shachtman, that was an American Trotskyite in the 1930s. Some of them had been more like social democrats, or what today would be called rad libs or something like that. But these are not people that come from any kind of conservative background. Like John Bolton, he's not a neocon. He's always been a Goldwater, Reagan, conservative hawk. But he's not a neocon. The Cheneys are not neocons either, at least not neocons proper. Now, a lot of those people, their views are virtually indistinguishable from neocons, so they may as well be, but that's not really their origin. But the neocons proper come out of the far left. And then in the 60s and 70s, there's a group of these people that start moving rightward, at least tactically, for several reasons. One is that they were being good Trotskyites. They were anti-Stalinists, so they were anti-Soviet Union, and eventually became Cold War hawks. Most of these people, the neocons, like a super majority, like 90+% of them were Jewish. So they were anti-Russian on anti-Semitism grounds. That was a big part of their Cold War hawkishness. Also, these people were hardcore Zionists, so they were very pro-Israel. And in the 60s and 70s, when the new left started turning towards third worldism and anti-imperialism, the neocons rejected that because they were pro-Israel, not an anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab and pro-American foreign policy in the Middle East, which they viewed as beneficial to Israel. Also, some of these people were relatively socially conservative compared to the new left. I mean, they were more like the old school communists. They were, they weren't that big on drugs and promiscuous sex and all of that kind of stuff. Also, some of them didn't exactly care for black people. Most of these folks were New York Jewish intellectuals, and there's a lengthy, black versus Jewish rivalry there that's kind of esoteric to outsiders, but it shaped their thinking, and they were against the Black Power movement, which they saw as anti-Semitic. Like way back, I think in the 1950s, one of the founders of neoconservatism, Nauman Podhoretz, wrote an essay called "My Negro Problem." So it's the neocons were basically old school leftists who were anti-Stalinist and pro-Zionist. And then they started making common cause with moderate liberals and disillusioned liberals and like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a U.S. senator at one point, or like James Q. Wilson, he was a social scientist who was widely considered to be a neocon, but he was just, he was just an official in the Nixon administration. You had these kind of moderate to liberal dissidents from the left, and then these neocons coming together, and that becomes this neoconservative movement in the 70s. And as Todd said, they were always very opportunistic. For example, in 1972, Nathan Glazer, who was an early neocon, one of the founders, and Irving Kristol, those two agreed that one of them would support George McGovern for the presidency, and the other one would support Richard Nixon for the presidency. That way, they would have a foot in the door. Their movement would have a foot in the door, no matter who became the actual president. So they've always worked the Democratic and Republican angle simultaneously. In the 70s, a lot of these folks started moving towards the right because they were pro-military industrial complex, because they were pro-Cold War and pro-Israel. Also, they started moving towards the economic right simply because they wanted to get corporate funding for their movement. So all of this was entirely opportunistic. They also started moving towards the religious right because they wanted to cultivate the Christian Zionist evangelicals, the Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson types. They wanted to cultivate those as basically useful idiots, or constituents or allies. Now, in the 80s, when Ronald Reagan became president, some of these people actually started finding their way into the government. There was a guy named William Bennett, for example, who wasn't Jewish. He was an Irish Catholic, but he was a protege of Irving Kristol, and Bennett became Reagan's Secretary of Education. And you started to see more of these people finding their way into the Reagan administration and then the Bush administration. For example, Elliot Abrams, he's the son-in-law of Norman Podhoretz. He was in the Reagan administration. And he was even in the Trump administration the first time Trump was in office. Now he's with the Council on Foreign Relations. He's gone back to the Rockefeller wing of the ruling class. But these folks have always worked the multiple partisan angles at the same time. And then over time, throughout the 80s and 90s, they started working their way into more and more positions of influence. They started taking over major DC think tanks in the so-called conservative movement, like Heritage Foundation and American Enterprise Institute, and some of those kinds of groups. There's another one called I forget what the full name of it is, the Washington Institute for the Middle East or Near East or something like that. That's one of the leading foreign policy think tanks for the Middle East. They took that over. And then in the Bush era, the George Bush Jr., they actually got control of the foreign policy apparatus of the United States. And that's when they started implementing their plans to knock out all of these countries in the Middle East that they viewed as enemies of Israel and enemies of American unipolar hegemony. And also you had a lot of energy companies that wanted access to some of the oil and gas resources in places like Iraq. So that's how we ended up getting the Iraq War and the war in Libya and the Syrian Civil War and all of these neocon fueled wars from the 2000s and 2010s, and it's still going on today. And along the way, the Zionists, in a wider sense, have gained more and more influence. Like I would say that up and through the George H.W. Bush administration, the WASPs, the traditional American WASP elites, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, were the dominant ethnic faction within the ruling class. You had other ethnic factions and religious factions as well. You had Irish Catholics like the Kennedys and all of that. You had maybe some German Americans, but like the Kochs, for example, like Fred Koch and all that. But the WASP elite, represented by figures like George H.W. Bush, or even Sunbelt capital, represented by Ronald Reagan and Barry Goldwater. Behind them, figures like the Hunts and that kind of stuff. the WASP elite was still dominant up until the end of the 80s. But I think in the 90s, several things happened simultaneously. The Cold War ended. The there was a generational changeover where the boomers became the dominant generation in the United States, surpassing the greatest generation and the silent generation. And there was also an ethnic changeover where you started to see a more ethnically diverse power elite and ruling class in which Jewish Zionists became key players. And you start to see this in the Bill Clinton administration with people like Madeleine Albright becoming Secretary of State, or you see this with George Bush Jr. with people like Paul Wolfowitz becoming the Undersecretary of Defense. And that's continued to escalate, to the present era, where nowadays, if you look at, the administration of the former Biden presidency, you see Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, with Donald Trump at present. You see guys like Mike Huckabee, as I call him, or Huckabee. You see him as the ambassador to Israel. So we've seen this kind of cultural, generational, demographic, ethnic, religious changeover to where Zionists have a much broader influence in the United States generally. And neocons are that, that's not just the neocons, that's a wider coterie of interests. Interestingly, now, though, the neocons have largely moved back to the Democratic Party. If you look at where all the surviving neocons are today, most of them have gone back and become Democrats once again. Bill Kristol is now a Democrat again. His friend George Will is now a Democrat. The Kagans were always Democrats, Victoria Nuland and those people. Norman Podhoretz is a Trump supporter, but he's 95 years old, and Midge Decter's died, and their son John is a Trump supporter, but he's a moron, but now some people also confuse people like Ben Shapiro with neocons. Ben Shapiro is not a neocon. He's just an Israeli nationalist. Like, the difference is a neocon has a very American-centric worldview. They believe in a Pax Americana. They want to have American unipolar hegemony, where America is like the Roman Empire or like the British Empire, and it rules the world ostensibly in the name of world peace and the greater good and all that. But they also want Israel to be co-equal partners in this, or at least top-level junior partners. So neocons are very American-centric. Now, the Israeli nationalist types, including some of the ones that currently dominate the Trump administration, they don't care about America. To them, America is just nothing but a benefactor and a collection of useful idiots for Israel. These are Israel firsters. Like Ben Shapiro, for example, is an Israel firster, not a neocon. And that's true of a lot of the people that are in the Trump administration at present as well. And you can see conflicts in the administration between these interests, between the more conventional nationalists on one hand and the Israeli nationalists on the other. So that's kind of where things stand today.
Okay, Florian.
Ha! Can you hear me?
Yep.
Perfect. Yeah, very, very interesting insight. I knew that the neocons were coming from a Trotskyite background and a left-wing background, which, if you think about it, maybe the adage that the left wing has done the march to the institutions, we forgot the neocons there as well, because I think what it seems to me, at least, is that the way they have entrenched themselves via their institutions and think tanks is kind of similar to how the left has entrenched itself. It's not a useful march through the institutions, really, because these guys are all a little bit older when they came to power as well, I think. But nevertheless, they have used very skillfully, a network out of think tanks to get themselves entrenched. And I think we said before that neocons have been very successful, very popular in a way. And I think that's from all the factions, right, that we talked about. And I think that's just because neocons have been uniquely successful, right? Now, you could say the liberals have not been successful, even they went through the same process and they have been maybe successful, but they haven't stay true to what they were originally saying, but that could just be because in the end, if you want to have power, you need to have a certain power differential, and that's at odds with the original grassroots nature of leftist causes. By the way, if you look back to the original conservatism, when you look at someone like Edmund Burke or the founding fathers, they would agree in some cases with neocons, but probably not in all. And my impression was always that the Burkean conservatism would mount to more like something, I don't know, the little house in the prairie conservatism, right? Families tilling the land, having a little farm, like nice meadows everywhere, and it's much more in that way. Conservatism is a very grassroots principle. As neoconservatism is very much opposed to that. It's like, in a way, you could think of neoconservatism as the brutalist side of conservatism. If you think about conservatism being like family with small little meadows and green ventures and birds flying, then imagine a neocon as like a big ugly building getting smacked there and pushing everything away, right? And spontaneously, I'm remembering what Adam Townsend said about Amazon, that they basically any Amazon fulfillment center has a crater around it, like a radius where nothing else grows, no business. The business just done if you have a fulfillment center. And I come up with a Amazon fulfillment center because there's of course a close tie of neoconservatives and capitalist institutions, right? In a way, conservatives ought to look at neocons as kind of like a toxic force, right? Also with their focus on Israel and which leads to forever wars, right? I think I would see there's one weakness in the political forte of the neocons. They aren't really in tune with the younger generation, right? They're kind of an old guard. So the modern conservatives and the guy you sent me the meme from, that was Jack Posobiec, others like Cernovich and other people, they are more modern conservative influencer, if you want to call them that, and they are not in line with neocons. But still, you have to see that some of the actions that the Trump administration has taken has at least been influenced by neocons, or is on the same wavelength as neocons would be. I mean, like bombing Iran is just like, that's probably very fine with neocons. They probably had wanted the U.S. to go a little further, but just going in there, bombing things, and then going out, that's probably fine with them too, right? So in a way, I'm wondering whether neocons will be able to stay alive politically for a longer while over the next 10 years, or whether they can only stay alive when they go back to the hive, if you will, go back to the liberals and basically take themselves totally out of the conservative movement. There was certainly a lot of whining from them when Trump took office, especially the second term. That's not our conservative party anymore, and all this wailing. And basically, if people knew that this coming from former leftists, then they would call complete bullshit on that. So my impression is, but I may be wrong, that neocons they don't have much of a hold in the modern conservative, more nationalist, populist climate, and then they will just shrink back into the liberal side to stay alive.
Yeah. To your point about the neocons being more successful than the liberals, Florian, part of that problem is the diseconomies of scope. A diseconomy of scope is where you have increased costs and reduced efficiency because you keep adding products from a corporate point of view, you keep adding products to what you're making. So if you just make one product, it can be really, really good. But if you make 10 and you all try to bundle it together, that creates a lot of problems, right? That also has a political effect, right? The old liberals, the New Deal liberals, had one goal. It was economic. It was to restrain capital and allow Americans to have, a middle class life. And then they deviated from that. We ended up here. The neocons have more or less one, maybe two goals, right? Goal number one, keep the military industrial complex going, and goal number two, have America wage Israel's wars for it. And they've been very successful at that. But we're also talking about the legacy. So we need to talk about now the complete disaster that is the Middle East, right? Let's go back to the 1990s. Yeah, we had or the 80s rather, or the 90s, yeah. There was the Persian Gulf War. That was really short. That was a preview of things to come, but it wasn't really that disastrous, not like what we would see later. So throughout the 90s, the Middle East is broadly pretty peaceful compared to the 80s, which had the Iran-Iraq War, and then the 60s and 70s, which had a lot of Arab-Israeli wars. And, it was steady as she goes. You had the dictators like Saddam Hussein in Iraq and Gaddafi in Libya and Assad in Syria, but, it was pretty stable. And then you have the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And, since then, we haven't really had any, quote, peace in the Middle East in a long time. And this would include North Africa, the Maghreb, like Libya, and so on and so on. And, we have millions of people displaced, which created the migrant crisis in Europe after 2011, most of them coming from places like Libya and Syria. One of the things that was known about Libya prior to the NATO intervention was that while the rest of West Africa was unstable, Libya was kind of a stopping off point. It was a stable place where people could go and live life and not have to worry about the warlords and the terrorists of other parts of West Africa. But when Gaddafi was toppled, that was like a stopper was removed, and that all just came into Europe. Syria also was like that. So with the displacement that occurred with the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, many refugees, specifically Christian refugees, went to Syria. Of course, that didn't work after 2011 when that all blew up. And so the actual human cost is pretty incredible, right? I forget how expensive the war on terror was all told, but it was trillions of dollars, which could have been spent on, improving American infrastructure and all the other stuff that the liberals used to spend money on for internal improvements. Millions displaced, millions dead. A region of the world that is completely shattered. There's very little political organization left. Terror groups are everywhere, right? The whole point was to fight terror, but what it did is it just created more terror groups, right? So you have ISIS and Al-Qaeda all over Africa now. You have, of course, and then this is also very interesting. In 1993, Dick Cheney was interviewed about why didn't we topple Saddam? And he said, we had no replacement. If we toppled Saddam in 91, Iran would have taken over. Well, interesting. That's exactly what happened, Dick Cheney. Why did you do that in 2003? That's a very interesting. So part of this is I think they wanted that, because if we step back to some of the things that I've been talking about with Sutton, the military-industrial complex needs wars. If you make weapons, you don't make money if you're not selling weapons. And so, Hitler was the bad guy du jour in the 40s, and then now we needed to fight the communists. And then when the communists fell apart in the early 90s, we needed to find a new enemy. And that was, Islamic terrorism, right? Saddam Hussein. But then when Saddam Hussein was removed, you needed somebody else. Well, that could be Iran now. It's been around for quite some time, and now they've included Russia and China. And so part of this is the galloping gurney of the military-industrial complex. If you have a for-profit war system, then you're just going to get more wars, because that's how you make money. Well, you're not going to make money if you don't sell your weapons, right? So, and then also the targets, Libya, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, all of these groups, whether it's the Arab Spring or direct intervention like Iraq in 2003 or Libya in 2011, benefit the security interests of Israel. So all of that comes together, but it's been a tremendous human cost, which has just left the Middle East utterly shattered. And again, the 90s were, except for the Gulf War was like a couple weeks. It wasn't that long. And it was a pretty good time in the Middle East compared to before, and certainly compared to after. And so that, I think, is going to be the real legacy of the neocons, just the millions of dead and displaced Arab populations throughout the Middle East and Africa. And I think also that's what's galvanized world opinion against the U.S. in general, allowing for this BRICS alliance to form. Keith.
Yeah, back in 1990, when the first Gulf War happened, when after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, I was a very strong opponent of that war because I thought it would turn out about like it did. I thought that it would be something that would be the beginning of a never-ending war in the region. You know, it would be like Vietnam in the Middle East. Now, it hasn't turned out to be that in terms of the depth of U.S. involvement and casualty levels and that kind of thing, but it's actually lasted about 4.5 times as long as the Vietnam War because it's really this series of Middle Eastern wars are really part of the same overall crusade. You know, we could say the first Gulf War never really ended because after that we had the no-fly zones, we had the blockades, we had the sanctions, and all of that. That lasted for 12 years, and then we had the second Iraq War. So we could really say the Iraq wars were just one big war that lasted for the better part of 2 decades. Also, my view back in the early 90s is that Ba'athist Iraq was a counterbalance to other nefarious forces in the region because you also had the Sunni fundamentalism coming out of the Gulf, and that had been particularly the case after the Grand Mosque crisis back in '79 when the Wahhabis started to gain full power in Saudi Arabia with the acquiescence of the House of Saud, of course. And then you also had, parallel to that, the Shia radicalism coming out of Iran, and that was a lot more intense back in the 80s than it was now. You also had, of course, Zionist expansionism from Israel, and then you had the rival Ba'athist faction in Syria. Like, if you want to know the difference between Syrian Ba'athism and Iraqi Ba'athism, it was kind of like the Stalin-Trotsky rivalry or the Hitler-Strasser rivalry. It's like the Saddam was a right-wing Ba'athist and the Assads were left-wing Ba'athist, but it's a similar dichotomy. And then there's also the Turks as well. So I thought at the time all of these things were necessary to counterbalance each other because that's basic realpolitik, Machiavelli 101. But what has happened is that American and Western intervention in the region has dislodged one of these systems after the other, and it hasn't made it better. It's actually made it worse. For instance, when the United States invaded Afghanistan in 2001, that was like right after 9/11. Everybody's jumping on the war fever bandwagon. I think polls showed something like 90+% of Americans were in favor of that particular war. But I was like, well, not so fast because we're not going to win. I knew the United States was not going to be able to successfully occupy Afghanistan indefinitely because the Soviets had just tried it and it lost. And so that war turned out about like I thought it would, although I thought it would take about 10 years. It ended up taking 20. And then when the war in Iraq began, as Todd said, I knew that if Saddam Hussein was dislodged, one of two things would happen. Either there would be a Sunni insurgency on the ground by Takfiris, or if the Shia majority became dominant, Iraq would become a satellite of Iran. Well, actually, both of those happened. That's how Iraq became a satellite of Iran, but we also had the Sunni insurgency on the ground with ISIS and groups like that. And the same thing has happened now in Syria. Now that the Assad regime has been dislodged, we now have a literal Al-Qaeda government in Syria. And there's actually more terrorists now than there were when the war on terrorism began. Like worldwide, there are probably more people involved in terrorism than there were in 2001. Certainly more people sympathetic to terrorism. And then the United States has shot its political capital along the way. Like after September 11th, most people were on America's side because we got attacked. Since then, we've completely destroyed our international credibility. Like I saw a international survey recently where it showed that the world's two most hated nations were number one, Israel, and number two, the United States. Right, so that's not a good position to be in geopolitically. And the recent Gaza situation has dramatically escalated that. And all of this stuff has happened with the neocons leading the charge. I mean, at every step, neocons, and it's not just neocons, not by any means. Like, for instance, nowadays there's a lot of liberal Democrats who try to say that they were against the Iraq War when it was going on. But if you go back and look at the voting records, or if they were in Congress, if you look at the speeches or comments they made to the media at the time, that's not true at all. The Clintons were in favor of the Iraq War. John Kerry was in favor of the Iraq War. So it wasn't just a neocon project. But the neocons have been sort of like the at the vanguard. If we invoke the Leninist concept of the vanguard, these guys have been the vanguard for constant, perpetual warfare in the Middle East. And as Todd said, there have been millions of people killed, tens of millions of refugees. That's one of the reasons why Europe has an immigration problem now. You have migrants escaping from war zones in the Middle East and in North Africa. Like even Gaddafi said that. Gaddafi said that if his regime fell, Southern Europe was going to have a migrant crisis, and they do. So none of this has brought any benefit to the United States or the Western world at all, as far as the big picture is concerned. Now, there's certainly been individuals who've built their careers on this, or groups that have found this to be profitable financially, or maybe certain ideological or cultural interests that have been advanced by this. But if you look at the impact of all of this for, say, Western countries like, North America, Europe, whatever, it's been a total disaster.
Yeah. Florian.
Yeah, agree wholeheartedly. I would add that, the neocons, if they have the role of the vanguard, then the neolibs aren't much better either. They appear as just like the same. To me, they seem to be the same, just a little bit more squeamish when it comes to use of military power. So they will work via U.S. aid and other non-government organizations, and then they support the groups in countries that are friendly to their interest, right? And of course they support the grassroots in Eastern European country, in Ukraine. That was all grassroots, for example. For whatever a lucky reason, those grassroots were all in line of the interest of the U.S., right? So they sent CIA in, and they foment color revolution, and they do that behind the scene. Almost seems to me like the vanguard does the first steps, and then the neoliberals swoop in and consolidate power behind the lines, in a way, right? And I think I would like to remind us about this one triangle, and you could call it the modern slavery triangle. Actually, you bomb the Middle East, you displace people, right? They flood the Western country, which reduces the cost of labor, which makes the big corporations more profit, and that gets more money for more bombs for the military industrial complex. But in a way, the MIC serves to basically, they serve as the motor of this destructive triangle, right? And then the outcome is that one nation gets more and more successful financially, and the people suffer. Problem is that nowadays more and more you have more and more migrants also coming to the U.S., and so you have American workers being displaced, and that leads to a lot of like, how should I say, a lot of anger, and so that would weaken the neoconservative position also, because now it's coming back to their own backyard and destroys labor here. I mean, if like starvation and lower wages, if that's just a thing of Europe, then you don't need to worry about it. But thing is, they also bring them over here, and you have lots of refugees, some of which at least find their way into the U.S., and that of course also suppresses the cost of labor, and that is bad for Americans, right? So it's kind of like a positive feedback loop that gets the neocons and neoliberals more and more power. And I will give them one thing: the neocons, especially, they know how to utilize power, which, by the way, also the left quite well knew how to use the power they had, how to leverage the political mandate they got, or they seemingly had, if you go back to the 1920s. But if you always cash in your political capital, like the neocons have done, if you always act on the power you have, then in the end, you suffer negative consequences from that because you destabilize the entire world, and that's sort of what we see happening.
Yeah, I agree. I think now we can maybe move into where the neocons are going to go. You mentioned, Florian, they're like an old guard, and Keith, you mentioned many of them are aging. I think because of that, and also the shift in the Republican Party with MAGA and Trump, and more broadly in this country as a whole, I do wonder, once the old guard of the neocons are dead, what the neocon position or movement will even be anymore. I mean, obviously there'll be a kind of like ghost in the machine still running the thing because of the inertia behind it, because of all the years of them being in charge for the last 30. But without without all of those men involved, because they're dead, can the neocon movement still continue? And furthermore, given your point, Florian, about the triangle, you can only hollow out Europe and America so much before it either A, totally falls apart, or B, they rise up against you. Those are going to be one of the two outcomes of this triangle you discussed. So I think ultimately, as with many movements that are very successful because they found a hack, and the neocon hack was clearly the military-industrial complex, because what they realized is what most people still don't realize. For-profit war making is what runs the whole world. And it's the U.S. military-industrial complex. In other countries, you can go back to Robert Engdahl's Emergence of Death, which was published in 1934, even before we had a military-industrial complex. And he said that then. You had Basil Zaharov in World War I, who was a Greek arms dealer who would still sell weapons to Turkey, who fought Greece right after World War I was over. So this used to be what American politics was about. Everybody used to know. This used to be a bipartisan Democrat, Republican, populist movement to hold these arms manufacturers, Emergence of Death, accountable. And that's just totally gone now. And it's been hidden. The actual people that are, and then of course the global security commons after World War II, where the U.S. military, specifically the Navy, allows for international trade. And they knew that. And they just leaned in on that all the way. And I think that's why they were more successful than their opponents. They had a more accurate view of how the world really works. Still, though, they're the victim of their own success, right? Because what we have seen is, as you said, Keith, as you predicted, I think like 10 years ago, that they would move to the Democratic Party. And that's because, for better or for worse, MAGA has taken over the Republican Party. And the neocons are not welcome there, at least not to the same degree that they were under, say, Reagan or the two Bushes, right? And so there's that. But then also their tricks, are running out. As you've said, Keith, there's more terrorists now than there were before the war on terror even started. And this ties into Stalin's dictum, the capitalists will sell you the rope you hang them with. You can only arm your enemies so long before you eventually lose to them in a fight. Because this is frankly an insane idea. Can you imagine Romans smuggling weapons to Attila the Hun? No, it just didn't happen. Nobody, the Roman state or Roman merchants did not sell weapons to Attila the Hun. That's ridiculous, right? Why would you do that? You'd lose. And you will lose on a long enough time scale doing this to somebody. And I think that somebody might be China. So I think the future of the neocons is that they are going to become victims of their own success. Once somebody keeps playing the same move again and again in a game, in this game, the game of global politics, everybody else will sooner or later figure out, hey, the game is rigged. I don't like the move you're playing. We're going to shift the whole game underneath your feet so you can't make that move anymore. And then with the triangle you described, Florian, they're going to hollow out the U.S. and Europe, which means they, either will have a complete collapse due to economics or have a revolution from below, in which case they'll be taken out. And then when they all die out, I mean, the Kagans are a bit younger, but these are not the people that are as savvy. These are the people that brought down the Soviet Union. Okay, bringing down the Soviet Union in the 80s was incredible. That was a feat no one thought was going to happen, and it was very savvy, very well played. Now, to be fair, Kissinger and Brzezinski weren't really neocons, but again, like Keith said, they have political beliefs that are indistinguishable from neocons. But the neocons today, the younger ones, aren't like the ones back then. And, they don't really seem to have successors groomed to take their place. So they might just be like an empty throne when they're all dead. And there's like this empty throne running this, brainless golem as it just blows everything up. That's sort of how I see the neocon movement going into the future. What do you think, Keith?
Yeah, well, just to clarify one thing, the Kissinger and Brzezinski were not neocons and not really even neocon adjacents. They were old school realist hawks. They were not doves; they were definitely hawks, but they were within the the tradition of the Rockefeller elites. They came from that circle, and even during the Reagan era, the Reagan represented the coming to power of Sunbelt capitalism against the Rockefeller establishment in the Northeast. But even the people around Ronald Reagan, a lot of them were, definitely hawks, but there was an element of old school, realism there as well. I mean, you had people like, say, Brent Scowcroft and those kinds of James Baker III. You had a lot of those kinds of people around Reagan as well. It's really in the 90s under Bill Clinton, I think, that the neocons and neocon adjacents really start to become dominant in foreign policy circles. And then that starts going through the roof in the Bush Jr. and in subsequent administrations, to where what we have now is a foreign policy establishment that I would say it's not necessarily neocon dominated as much as it's neoconized, in the sense that it includes the dominance of a lot of people that have ideas that are very similar to the neocons. Right now, if you look at the foreign policy establishment in the Democratic Party, they are essentially neocons in all but name. I mean, they have the same basic outlook as the neocons. Like if you saw the foreign policy aspect of Kamala Harris's presidential nomination speech last year, it's basically just straight neoconism, or might as well be. And she was out there campaigning with Liz Cheney. Well, that's what was signaling to the military-industrial complex and related interest that, hey, we got it, we're under control. We're not doves. We're not George McGovern or anything like that. So right now, the Democrats have become a neoconized party. Whether the individuals have their roots in neocons or personally identify as neocons or not, it's definitely a coterie of neocons and neocon adjacents. And then the Republicans, at the ground level, what has happened to the Republican Party is what I always thought would happen going back years ago. Is I always thought that as the cultural right continued to lose influence demographically and culturally, that the cultural right would become more militant, and then the populist right would emerge in opposition to that. And that's kind of what the Republicans are now on more of the ground level, intermediary level. They're more right-wing populist than traditional conservative per se, as the Never Trumpers always point out. But at the elite level, the Republican Party is still controlled by the military-industrial complex and by the Israeli nationalists, and those, the Israeli nationalists are able to control the Republican Party because their interests jive with those of the military-industrial complex and the Sun Belt. That's the reason for that. So you basically have an Israeli nationalist party on one hand, and then a neocon party on the other hand. Like an analogy might be to like the Trotsky-Stalin rival. We could say like the Republicans are now like a Zionist vanguard party, just like the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was a Marxist vanguard party. And we could say that the Democrats are like a Trotskyite party, where the idea, like the Trotskyite idea, is like you have a united front where the revolutionaries are embedded in a wider coalition of liberals and centrists and socialists and other stuff. Or we could compare it to the NSDAP. We could say that the Republicans, are like the Hitler-Himmler wing. They only care about controlling the military, the police, and working with crony capitalists, whereas the Democrats are like the Strasser-Rome wing. It's basically the same ideology, only more homosexuals and environmentalists and literal socialists and that kind of stuff. And that's where the foreign policy establishment is now. The Israeli nationalists on one hand, the neocons on the other. and they're able to do that because of their relationship to the military-industrial complex. And I don't really see that changing. The only thing that's going to change it is power of public opinion. If you look back at the Vietnam War, why did the American involvement in the Vietnam War end? Well, because it just became overwhelmingly unpopular with the general public, irrespective of what anybody's other political views were. And I think that is probably what will end the dominance of the neocons. If we look at generational trends, we see that more and more younger people have views that are not sympathetic to the neocon paradigm. We see a lot of young Jewish Americans who are becoming anti-Zionist, or at least Zionist indifferent. And certainly that's true of Gentile young people. Also, we see that these endless warfare is becoming unpopular in a lot of places. Like, we have a lot of younger conservatives nowadays who say, well, we don't know about all this endless war. Like when I come across when I come across Republicans, like younger Republicans nowadays, who are say in their 20s and maybe their early middle 30s, they're much different than the younger Republicans I would have known, say, 30 years ago. I know back in the day, most young Republican types, like when I was an undergrad in college, I used to come across young Republican clubs and stuff all the time. And these guys would typically have a very gung-ho, got to fight the commies and, kill a commie for mommy. Or if they were more intelligent, it was like peace through strength, the Reaganite Gingrich paradigm. But nowadays, they tend to be almost like old school Republicans from the pre-World War II era. They tend to be more like, if not isolationist, at least realist or more moderate in their foreign policy views. So, and that's true on the left as well. Like this guy who won the Democratic Party primary for mayor of New York City. He's I think he's an Indian American Muslim socialist or something like that, but anti-Israel or anti-Zionism. Even though the mayor's not a foreign policy position, but it's obvious that a big part of his popularity was his anti-Zionist stance. And we see the growth of popular influencers on the right who take a dissenting view from all of that. Candace Owens, Dave Smith, Tucker Carlson to some degree. So I think once public opinion changes dramatically to where the public just does not accept any of this anymore, then policymakers are going to have to start capitulating more to public opinion, just like they did after the Vietnam War. Like the draft became very unpopular in the Vietnam War, to the point that many people just said, well, I'm just not going to be drafted. I'm just going to go to jail, or I'll just leave the United States or something like that. And there has not been a military draft for over half a century since then. And the same thing was true with the war in Vietnam itself. I think the long-term impact of that is that a lot of Americans got to the point where they're just not going to accept war if it means any real sacrifices on their own side. There hasn't been any wars since Vietnam that had that kind of casualty volume on the American side. And Americans today would never accept something like a fuel rationing or meat rationing or sugar rationing or special war tax. Imagine if, like, the U.S. president said, we're going to have a 50% tax on fuel to pay for, war with Iran. He'd be impeached. And that was the legacy, I think, of the Vietnam War. And I think that what's going on in the Middle East, once that gets to that point, that's when there'll be a change.
Florian.
Yeah, I'm reminded what Steve Bannon mentioned in 2016, I believe, that the future is populist. And the question is whether it's from the right or from the left. And we also talked about elite finance capital as the true ruling elite of the world. And to me, they seem to be positioned themselves to navigate the new factions, but it must be new for them as well, right? And especially a problem if they support more of Israel, because there is a fatigue toward Israel, I think, on the left, certainly, on the right, more and more. I think the right will keep up Zionism for pragmatic reasons, right? For example, if we can get economic benefits from our presence in the Middle East, like very, very popular example, the Strait of Hormuz and other if we can let trade go through those areas, which actually doesn't go as well as it did in the past, thanks to the Houthis, but in general, right? So that would be pragmatic economic reasons, but there's no Israel as the big example of democracy or the big moral duty we owe Israel, anything like that. That narrative has failed. That's gone basically, right? And that was one of the mistakes that Israel also did, that they basically relied on the Holocaust narrative, which was very prominent and very obvious to everyone in after the Second World War. But it seems like they have fallen back on that narrative again and again and again, and lazily used it to justify anything they wanted to do. Which part of it was, let's face it, territorialism, and that is not something that nowadays those generations they don't remember the Zoomers, Generation Alpha. They don't remember the Second World War and the Holocaust. They don't remember it viscerally, right? So they will only support Israel from pragmatic reasons. In other words, Israel will have to come up with some reasons why we should support them, and this is more and more true since all the old neocon guard is basically fading away. Which the neocons had a lot of Jewish people in there, so for them it was a no-brainer to support their own homeland. That is also more and more gone now, right? And also the pro-Iran war attitude, or if you want to even call it war, the 12-day war, the most recent part, it was not the same as the pro-Iraq attitude, right? I think that's one reason why Trump only did some airstrikes with a guaranteed success or somewhat guaranteed success, right? For example, remember when then they shot down an Iranian drone that was getting dangerously close to U.S. forces, and people like Bolton wanted to push Trump for retaliation against Iran, and Trump said, "No, I'm not going to do that." Official explanation was that would cause like 500 deaths, people just for one drone, just retaliation for one drone. I'm not going to do it. And there's a funny passage in in a book that John Bolton wrote, where he was completely nonplussed by braving the traffic in Washington D.C. to get to that meeting about this Iranian drone in the White House. And when he just came to the door, then Trump had said, "We're not doing the retaliation," and Bolton was so pissed and so disappointed. He actually put that in his book. That's how you see how smart these people really are, right? And I think for that reason, there's going to be some power shifts, and we'll have more populist politics going into the future, more from the right, more from the left, maybe something in between. I want to say this, that the pro-Palestinian case, or like the pointing out any atrocities that Israel did, that always comes, or majority comes, from people that live on campuses in a very left-wing environment. And as such, that message is not appealing at all to MAGA people, to younger Republicans. That's one of the reasons why they will reflexively side with Israel, because they perceive the criticism on Israel from the left basically being also like an anti-white protest, right? In a way, and some people have said that, and I even believe that to a certain extent, that Mamdani is actually not like a Muslim. Yeah, he is, but that's not his main point. The main problem is he is what some people call a gay race communist, and basically describes the pro-LGBTQ socialist-infused anti-Israel message. And as I said, the right would be much more sympathetic towards holding Israel accountable. But since all the criticism on Israel comes mainly, not all, but mainly comes from the left, it's a hard sell for the right to get on board with that too.
All right. So to wrap it up, I'll just paraphrase Uncle Ted. The neoconservatives and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. Final thoughts, Keith?
I think that the future of the United States is probably going to be one where the United States has a much shorter international reach as well. I talked before about popular opinion and how that's going to influence foreign policy is, people get tired of never-ending war, and there's a generational changeover and all that. But I do think that there's going to be more constraints on the ability of the United States to project power internationally. We're not going to be in the world of, say, the late Cold War, where the United States could go around carrying out coups and all over the place, in Guatemala or Chile, or arming multiple insurgents around the world at the same time, in Cambodia and Indonesia and Afghanistan and Nicaragua and El Salvador and Africa. I think American influence is still going to be there and may even be the most powerful nation for a long time to come, but it's still going to be constrained by a world that's more like the 19th century, where in the 19th century you had the British Empire, but as the dominant power, but it was also constrained by the influence of the French, the Germans, the Russians, the Americans, the Ottomans, the Japanese were a rising power, all the other European colonial empires. And it seems to me that's what we're moving towards now. We're moving towards a system where the United States is kind of like the British Empire in the late 19th century, but we also see the rise of European Union taking more initiative, and Russia is revitalized and becoming a world power again, and China is almost on par with the United States in terms of economic parity. And then you see all these rising lesser powers, India and Indonesia, and South Africa, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Argentina. All of these places are rising as well, and that's going to put constraints on the ability of the Americans to, say, interfere in the internal politics of other countries, or initiate coups or armed struggle or direct invasions and that kind of thing. So I think the combination of shifts in popular opinion and generational and cultural shifts in the United States, combined with external constraints of a geopolitical nature, and also economic constraints, as the United States becomes more and more indebted, and economic problems are much more serious as far as disparity between rich and poor and that kind of thing. That's going to be ultimately what ends the neocon foreign policy paradigm.
Okay, Florian, last words.
Yeah, I think Keith is right, and the U.S. will have much less of a much weaker influence internationally, not only through BRICS, but also, I think, most importantly, also the moral justification for the U.S. as a world policeman has run its course, and in a way, it has been run into the ground by the neocons, right? So, as we said in the beginning, the neocons were the ones that were most truthful to their concept of forever wars. But that, I think, has also been their undoing, because it has stabilized the world and people are understanding it for that. By the way, and I would like to point that out, the European Union is not weak, not militarily weak, not economically weak. They're just governed in a very meek and very incompetent way. But if they get their act together, then they can be a very formidable power. And it's not like, some people said Europe is like a museum at this moment, but no, yes, they are in a way, but they can actually get back to the power that they actually have is much stronger than you would think. They probably, if they get their act together, they could probably be a strong bulwark against Russia without needing much support from the U.S. I mean, they have nuclear weapons, for example, like a couple dozens. That should be enough of a deterrent for the immediate future, at least. So I think it's going to be very, very interesting how world power balance will shift, but it will shift in a very specific way. That I do believe.
All right. Thank you again, Keith and Florian. It's always a pleasure. It's Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.